Not. There is a particular kind of failure that history finds almost unbearable to look at directly. It is not the failure of a company that never had the vision, or the collapse of a venture that was always underfunded and outmatched. It is the failure of an organization that had every advantage, every insight, and every tool it needed to own the future, and then watch someone else build that future instead. That is the story of Xerox. To understand how Xerox lost the computer age, you first have to understand how completely it dominated the age before it. Xerox Corporation, through its pioneering work in plain paper copying, became one of the most profitable and culturally embedded technology companies in American business history. The Xerox name became a verb. People did not photocopy documents, they Xeroxed them. That kind of linguistic ownership is the rarest form of market dominance. It signals that a company has not merely sold a product, but has redefined a behavior. The copying business was built on a deeply effective economic model. The machines were leased, not sold. Supplies and service contracts generated recurring revenue. Customers were locked in by habit and infrastructure. It was, in the language of modern business analysis, a subscription model before subscriptions had a name. The margins were extraordinary, the competitive moat appeared wide, and the cash flow was more than sufficient to fund almost any research ambition the company chose. And Xerox did choose research. In 1970, the company opened the Palo Alto Research Center, known universally as PARC, in the heart of what would become Silicon Valley. The mandate was broad and visionary: recruit the best minds in computer science and give them room to imagine the future of information technology. What followed was one of the most concentrated bursts of technological invention in the history of computing. PARC researchers developed the graphical user interface, the windows, icons, and mouse-driven desktop environment that is now the universal language of personal computing. They built Ethernet, the networking protocol that would eventually wire together the entire world. They created laser printing, object-oriented programming concepts, and what was arguably the first true personal workstation, the Alto. The Alto was not a research prototype in the marginal sense. It was a functioning machine with a bitmapped display, a mouse, and software that allowed users to edit documents in a way that looked on screen exactly as they would appear on paper. This was the 1970s. The personal computer revolution, as historians of technology have documented, emerged in the 1970s from the convergence of microprocessor economics and individual computing ambition. A personal computer, distinct from a mainframe or time-shared system, was designed for one person, one task, one moment of productive intention. PARC had already built the conceptual and technical architecture for precisely this machine. The gap between what existed at PARC and what Xerox brought to market was not a gap in engineering. It was a gap in organizational will. The structural weakness was already embedded in the culture of success. Xerox's core business was thriving. The copying division generated enormous profits and commanded enormous internal attention. Research that could not be directly mapped to copier revenue was an interesting curiosity, not a strategic priority. The organizational gravity always pulled back toward the machine that was already making money. This is not an unusual dynamic in large companies. It has been observed and described by researchers studying why established organizations struggle to pursue disruptive innovation. But at Xerox, it operated with unusual destructive force because the gap between what PARC had and what the market was about to need was so precisely, so cruelly wide. The decisions made during the critical window of the late 1970s and early 1980s reflected these constraints. Xerox did eventually commercialize some of the PARC research. The Xerox Star, introduced in 1981, was a genuine commercial workstation built around a graphical interface. It was priced at approximately $16,000 per unit, aimed at corporate office environments, and required a server infrastructure that added significantly to the total cost. The pricing reflected the economics of the copying business: high-margin, enterprise-focused, lease and service, rather than the economics of the emerging personal computer market, which was moving aggressively toward affordability and individual ownership. Meanwhile, Apple was founded in 1976 by Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and Ronald Wayne, and incorporated the following year. The company was building toward a different vision of computing: personal, accessible, and designed for the individual rather than the corporate department. In a now widely discussed episode, Steve Jobs and a group of Apple engineers visited PARC and observed the graphical interface and mouse-driven environment that had been developed there. Apple went on to incorporate graphical interface concepts into the Lisa and then the Macintosh, which launched in 1984. The Mac became the product line that Apple has marketed continuously since that year, evolving through decades into the hardware family it maintains today. The competitive unraveling that followed was not instantaneous. It was the slow, structural kind. Xerox held considerable market presence in its core segments, but the computing market it had helped invent, and which its research had technically equipped it to lead, was captured by others. Apple commercialized the interface paradigm. Microsoft scaled it across IBM-compatible hardware. The personal computer became, as the history of the industry records, a mass-market consumer device, precisely the kind of device that the interactive, individual use vision implied, and precisely the kind of device Xerox's business model was not configured to produce or price. The outcome was a company that remained significant in its legacy markets while watching the larger technology industry organize itself around concepts its own researchers had pioneered. Xerox continued to operate, restructured over subsequent decades, and eventually split its business units. The PARC laboratory itself continued as a research institution, but the window in which Xerox might have translated its research advantage into computing market leadership had closed. The aftermath touched more than one company. The graphical interface concepts that traveled from PARC through Apple and eventually through Microsoft shaped the entire subsequent architecture of personal computing. The people who worked at PARC carried their ideas and methods into the broader industry. Ethernet became the backbone of networked computing worldwide. Laser printing became a staple of offices everywhere, including, with some irony, as a Xerox product in that narrower domain. The ideas did not die. They simply found other institutional homes. The precise mechanism of failure here is worth stating carefully, because it is more instructive than a simpler story about missed opportunity. Xerox did not fail to see the future. Its researchers had built the future. The failure was organizational and structural. The company's most profitable existing business created incentive structures, pricing assumptions, and resource allocation patterns that made it functionally impossible to commercialize a disruptive innovation at the price point and scale the market required. The research and the business were in the same building but operating under entirely different economic logics. When those two logics came into conflict, the profitable present defeated the transformative future every time a resource decision was made. The lesson is not that research centers are wasteful or that vision is insufficient. or that one leader made a catastrophic choice. The lesson is structural. An organization's ability to act on what it knows is constrained not by knowledge, but by the economic commitments it has already made. Xerox knew. PARC had built the proof. The constraint was not intelligence. It was that the copying machine was already printing money, and nothing in the organizational architecture forced anyone to bet that future against a computer nobody had yet asked for. By the time the market made the ask loud enough to hear, someone else was already answering.